Who in here has ever had an imposter syndrome? Or ever just felt that you weren't qualified or good enough or the right person to lead? Whether it's to lead people or to lead a project or a certain task, just by a show of hands. Quite a few, right? Especially after we've become a leader in a new leadership position and we question ourselves saying, how in the heck did they choose me for this? I don't have the answers. What am I even doing here? And there are stories in our lives that contribute to us having this negative thinking. When I was 4, my parents had divorced about the year before, and I was at his house, and he asked me if I wanted to go to daycare or if I wanted to stay with him for the day. Now, I knew that he worked third shift and that he usually slept all day and that it was not fun playing with one or two toys by myself, nor was it fun if I woke him up for anything, that I would get the wrath upon me if I were to do that. So I made the decision to go to daycare. Well, he took me to daycare. He dropped me off, 4 years old, and he never came to pick me up. And I didn't see him again until I was 16. Now, I know that's his story. That's his stuff that he had to deal with, but it leaves an impression on a 4-year-old that you carry with you and can quite develop an imposter syndrome that rears its ugly head each and every time when you're placed in a leadership position or when you feel like people are looking to you for answers. So, how do we lead in times when we feel like we just don't have the answers? Well, let me go back to where I started. A question. Rilke, the poet, the German-Austrian poet, said that we have to learn to live the questions and not focus so much on the answers. He said, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So I want to pause for a moment and let that kind of sink in. It's not what we're usually told, is it? Usually we have the idea that we have to have all the answers if we're going to be leaders. That's what leaders do. But no. Individual contributors should have a lot of answers, especially if you're an engineer who is developing a product or a software or whatever the case may be. But if you're a true leader, we have to have the right questions to ask. Positive, open-ended questions, and we'll get into that later, that will empower others to gain buy-in on their own. Because inherently, many people already have the answers. Now, let me go on to another suggestion as to how we can overcome the thinking, again, that we are not good enough or that we aren't suited for leadership or whatever that inner voice tells us sometimes. Not all leaders have titles. And not everybody with a title has power. Let me distill that a little bit. There are people in every organization who are leaders. They don't have titles. Think about in church or Cub Scouts or some nonprofit or some organization that you belong to, and maybe even a family unit, where it's that little unassuming person sitting in the very back who, when she says, jump, a whole lot of people say, how high? We've all seen those people before, right? They don't seem to be much. They're pretty quiet. They don't have that boisterous character like leaders should have. But I'll tell you what, they have power. Not power over, but power with. There's a big difference. Power over is authoritarian. Power over is the people with the egos who pretend they have all the answers. Power with is to sit beside someone and lead even when you're not saying anything. That is powerful, all pun intended, leadership. Another aspect that will help to overcome the negative thinking that we have about ourselves as leaders is to start leading now. In other words, even if you don't have a leadership title, even if maybe you're not even working, so you don't have any title, that doesn't matter. You can still lead, and you should. Because leadership happens everywhere. It happens out in the community. It happens in our families. It happens among our friends and in the groups that we associate with and the associations and organizations. It doesn't have to be a position in a company that calls us to lead. So I want to encourage you that in your families, among your friends, learn to actively listen. Ask positive, open-ended questions. And the reason why we want them to be positive and open-ended is because a close-ended question will only elicit a yes or a no, or a maybe at best. That's not a conversation. That's not relationship building. That's not leadership. But if we ask a positive, open-ended question, it automatically puts the receiver in their prefrontal cortex, and they can't help but think about the answer. And as they think about it, and they tell you what they're thinking or how they're feeling, and you are actively listening, you are leading. Doesn't matter where you're doing this. You're not only leading, but you're having a huge impact. So I want you to keep that in mind, and that is great practice for when the day comes that you do have a title and you're leading many people. Because the common denominator, friends, is that we are all human beings. Doesn't matter what our titles are. We're all humans. And each and every one of us has feelings, we have emotions, we have biases, we have lots of things. But if we lead well, we can have a great impact. Next, I want to say lead and learn. Now, many times when we get a title, especially if it's a nice, fancy title, starting with a C maybe, or a VP, we get the idea that we have to be the best teacher in the room. Well, let me tell you, I've learned the hard way many times, hitting my head, looking silly, that I'm much better off being the best student in the room than the best teacher. Because students ask questions. Students are curious. Students have a growth mindset. Students have a beginner's mind, and they're willing to see the system and understand it for what it really is, instead of being honed in on so much knowledge and know-how that they can only see it one way. So be a really, really good student. Ask a lot of questions and give space for people to respond and even get comfortable with the silence. Friends, we all can lead. Doesn't matter what your name is, doesn't matter what your title is, it doesn't matter where you came from, doesn't matter what your family unit looks like. You can lead, and you should. And you're qualified, and you're good enough.